can't take away learning in a separate container. Once you've paid for it, you're forced to take it in with your very soul to learn it and to go away either harmed by it or improved. I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and this is where not to start with Plato. Plato, of course, is an enormous thinker, a huge influence, not just on philosophy in Western civilization, but on education, on literature, on the arts, on just a huge, on government. And of course, he was a voluminous writer. We have many, many dialogues that he wrote, and plenty others that were attributed to him by students centuries, plural, later, really as an act of honor to Plato. He's, to a large degree, our key transmitter of the historical Socrates, who left no writings of his own. And so Plato is a writer who's frequently assigned. He's this huge influence, and yet where should we start when we read Plato? Well, the Viking Portable Library includes the most famous works of the most influential mind in Western philosophy: Protagoras, Phaedo, Symposium, and the Republic. And I think this is a good example of some of the most famous writings from Plato, but not necessarily the best place to start. So I want to go into sort of three what I regard as traps for a reader who wants to start reading Plato, and then identify a couple of recommendations and maybe even a next step after you've read some Plato and hopefully enjoyed and learned something, improved by the learning that you've dealt with in your very soul. But let's talk about where not to start. And where not to start might be the very early dialogues of Plato. The early Socratic dialogues: Ion, Laches, Charmides, Hippias Major and Minor, the Euthydymas. These the early dialogues of Plato really do seem to represent historical conversations that Socrates would have had. They give us that sense of Socrates giving a premise and then questioning some expert on a topic, ultimately exposing the expert as somebody who really doesn't know what they're talking about. And we're left in the end not necessarily having come to an answer, but having realized that the answer we thought was good just isn't strong enough. And that's wonderful. But the problem with these early Socratic dialogues is that most of them don't really deal with anything that's of vital importance, I think, to a modern reader. They deal with art or this Greek concept of courage or bravery. And so that's, I think, a weakness in the early Socratic dialogues. We do get something that's probably closer to the historical Socrates. Plato's not just using Socrates as a character in his dialogue to be a mouthpiece for Plato's own ideas, but they're just not as interesting. They're not as strong. There's one exception here in terms of what I'll recommend later. The second humongous pitfall for a would-be reader of Plato, and it's the mistake I made when I was very young. I want to say 9, maybe 10, would be to dive into the Timaeus Critias. Now, we don't find readers, or especially young readers, or precocious readers of Plato, diving into this one because it has the classic painting from Raphael, the School of Athens, where we've got Plato pointing up to the sky to show his forms, and Aristotle pointing out at what's important out here. That's not why. People gravitate to these two works because of the myth of Atlantis, which Plato made up. And it's in here. It's a great little metaphor for something. But Timaeus is a very, very dense work. It's a later work. It is, to a large degree, Plato's cosmological dialogue. He's all about physics and the creation of the universe and what that would mean in terms of immortality and the soul. And he talks about Atlantis as well and all of that. It's not even really a dialogue per se. It's mostly an extended monologue. So again, people jump into this, and because of Atlantis, or because it's very famous, the Timaeus is included in the Viking Portable Greek Reader as the single representation of Plato. But it's not particularly representative of Plato. Plato is interested in the soul. He's interested in immortality. He's interested in the forms. But he's also interested in virtue to a very large degree, and I think Socrates also was, and that's almost absent from the Timaeus. Critias is even a worse place to start because we don't have the ending. It either was not quite finished or the ending was lost. Atlantis is a really cool idea, but I don't think you should read Plato's dialogues that involve Atlantis first. That's just not useful. The last place would be, the third one that I think is a huge pitfall, is the Republic. And that is frequently assigned. deals, of course, with government. It's a very, very influential dialogue in terms of thinking around human societies and governance. Probably tends towards supporting totalitarian states, certainly to a greater degree than I ever would endorse. So it's frequently assigned in schools, and it includes the great Allegory of the Cave, which is a fantastic passage. That is one of the best passages that would be a truly great place to start with Plato. But the Republic itself, I think a reader who has a grounding in Plato and also has a grounding in the historical context in which the Republic was written, in the aftermath of the Peloponnesian War, in the aftermath of the state execution of Socrates, those are huge influences on what the arguments Plato is making for a good government in the Republic. And I think a reader needs those in order to get the most out of the Republic. So I gave 3 places that I think a lot of people want to jump in towards and yet end up maybe not getting the most out of Plato. So where should we start if we're going to start reading Plato? Well, I think a great place, a truly great place to start is with the dialogues that are sort of viewed as the last days of Socrates. The Euthyphro isn't essential, but the Apologia is fantastic. Crito is amazing. And even the Phaedo, while being significantly more complex than the Apologia and Crito, is a very strong work after you've read those first 2. So the Apologia, of course, is the trial of Socrates. We get Socrates, we get the passion, we get the energy, we get the sarcasm, that smirking sense that you just get from that lifts off the page, and that almost certainly was not just created by Plato, that Socrates actually possessed that charisma, and it's a strange charisma. And what's beautiful about the Apology of Socrates is we can compare Plato's version with Xenophon's. I did that in a video in January, which I'll link in the description box. But the Apology is a great one, and Crito is fantastic. Crito might be, at times it vies with being my favorite dialogue from Plato. It's a really beautiful argument in which Socrates defends his decision to go through with his execution and not run away, which his friends, Crito being one of them, are trying to get him to do. And this idea that then extends into the Phaedo, where Socrates on his final day is explaining his thoughts around immortality and afterlife, his soul, and why he believes that, he is going to have a good afterlife because he has lived a good life and he has stayed consistent and is ending that life well. And so this is a fantastic place to start. Highly, highly recommend that. The second place that, sort of once you have that, because it gives you a little bit of historical Socrates and it gives you a great sense of, those ideas around virtue, is to extend those questions around virtue and good into the Protagoras dialogue, which is fantastic. It also presents us with one of the few times where Socrates doesn't absolutely embarrass and humiliate his interlocutor, his expert. Protagoras, as a very famous sophist and thinker, and Socrates try to identify, is it possible to teach virtue? Is it possible, which is where the quote at the beginning came from, is it possible to teach a person how to be good? And then should you be paying for that? As Protagoras, of course, was charging. And Socrates is younger in this dialogue, but it is a middle dialogue from Plato. We have, a historical Socrates, but very much with the middle Platonic style. Plato is really thinking through everything he wants to share here. It's probably not just a dialogue that was discussed by the students of Socrates, Plato being one of them, and then written down. Plato's hand is very evident in this, and the Meno is an excellent extension of that as well. So this would be a great sort of second step in understanding Plato, understanding those ideas. And then finally, if you absolutely want a quick, short dialogue with the historical Socrates, where he's going to have some fun, Hippias Minor is the place to go. Socrates famously loves to get his opponent to agree to a premise. If those are both true, let's extend it. This would also be true. The person then goes, oh, but that in Socrates, that doesn't really work, does it? So let's pull back. Maybe we need to question these. We need to workshop these ideas. You're the expert. Help me out with this. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just, all I recognize is that I don't know what I'm doing. Help me out. Let's workshop these ideas. It's never on better display than in Hippias Minor, where Socrates, going totally against everything he says in Crito or Protagoras about virtue and good, makes a really strong argument for the person who intentionally loses a race despite being very, very fast, or a stronger, better, faster wrestler intentionally sandbagging and allowing himself to lose is secretly better, because you can only intentionally lose if you're actually better than the other person. The absurdities are an absolute delight, and so Hippias Minor is one that I highly recommend, just for the sense of humor and the humanity that we get both from Socrates, but I think also from Plato as a writer in this one. There's a sense of fun. So those would be places I certainly recommend starting. After that, of course, ultimately you can work your way up to not only the Republic, which, I mean, the Allegory of the Cave would be a fun place to start if you want a real quick 10 minutes, and then 20 minutes would be Hippias Minor. But eventually you work your way up to Euthydymas and this idea around what is knowledge, one of the certainly most interesting works, but also one of by far the densest and most complex works. The Symposium, which is filled with a cast of characters, one of whom is Aristophanes, the great comedian. I just think this is a little bit overrated, though I will say Socrates is not an angry drinking companion. He's very gentle in his arguments in the Symposium. And, you know, there are plenty of other dialogues from Plato, Parmenides, the Laws, all sorts of stuff to enjoy. But you might also be interested in Aristotle. You know, once you've got the forms, get out there and get the Nicomachean Ethics. The one thing to be aware of with Aristotle is that we don't necessarily have, they're not dialogues at all, but we don't necessarily have Aristotle's actual writings in the way that we have Plato's. We have some of Aristotle's writings, like Physics and the Organon compilation. But a number of Aristotle's philosophical works, what we really have are basically the lecture notes, and so they're going to read that way. They're certainly there's not the energy and the passion that you get in Plato, that I think has made him, at least in my reading, certainly a more interesting reading experience than Aristotle. But there are some ideas in here that have merit, certainly. So this is where not to start with Plato, with a couple of good recommendations. Let me know what your experiences are with Plato. Let me know if you'd like to read any of these or see more videos on these. But again, I hope everybody's having a great week. And remember, you can't take the learning in a separate container. Deal with it and hopefully you're improved. Thanks.